Yes, that's now recording. Good. Welcome to US Studies Online's May Book Hour. This month is special because we are introducing our first Undergraduates Book Club Book Hour. We hope to collaborate with undergraduates will become a new staple with each semester of our book hours. The idea is to expand interest in the broad field of American studies and show how we can move away from the patriarchal Eurocentrism that often dominates higher education in the UK. Also within American studies, we are conscious to make efforts to move away from the traditional white hetero-patriarchal colonizing in curriculums. The first book we have chosen for this first book club is the novella The Deep, written by Rivers Solomon. And as a short synopsis, The Deep is a novella that depicts a utopian underwater society built by the water-breathing descendants of pregnant enslaved thrown overboard from slave ships. The story is told from the perspective of Yetu, the protagonist, a memory keeper of her people. Alongside Solomon, David Dix, William Hutson, and Jonathan Snipes, the members of the experimental hip-hop group Clipping are credited. They had written the song The Deep, which the novella is based on. Clipping, in turn, based their song on the mythological universe by the acid techno group Drexciya, whose records refer to a utopian underwater civilization founded by African mothers thrown overboard from transatlantic slave ships. I've read somewhere it has been described as if Wakanda were Atlantis. The most important thing I want to point out is that our purpose is not to get the book, not to place an interpretation onto it or try to explain its purpose and its magnitude in history, culture, and literary fields, because fundamentally it is not our cultural experience. What we do want to do is to discuss the pedagogical merits and how and why we might want to approach this text within American studies. We want to start to build a way to step out of our own narratives and to begin to build a broader understanding. We will provide some suggestions for further discussion on The Deep and the magnitude of its links and are listed below, which we encourage you to engage with as you read The Deep yourselves, which I hope you do. Today, we have 4 undergraduate students joining us. Megan Hayes, a second-year history student at the University of Durham. Naomi Wallace, a second-year English literature and history student at the University of Edinburgh. Liam Muir, a third year in joint honours English literature and history student at the University of Dundee, and Nellie Hutson, a first-year English literature and American studies student at the University of Manchester. Welcome, everyone. Could you shortly add to that introduction how and why you're interested getting involved in American studies and why are you joining us today?
Shall I start?
Go for it, Liam.
I sensed hesitation there. Okay, so yeah, well, I basically just started getting into American studies when I first read John Steinbeck, really. That was when I really started to appreciate the magnitude of what it meant for the country of America to exist in some kind of individual, like distinct sense. So I started to get more interested in that being like almost like a blank canvas from Europe and whatnot, and like a fresh slate and all these different ideas competing for what American society is going to be like. So a lot of the modules I've been doing in my undergrad have been informing or continuing my interest in that idea. So that's where my interest in American studies originated, probably.
Naomi?
So it's interesting for me because I'm actually largely interested in kind of early modern and late medieval English lit. So the American stuff is more of like an outside recreational interest. I'm a huge fan of American women's writing, so like Toni Morrison, Margaret Atwood, Alice Walker, those kind of novels. And that's been really an avenue for me to kind of explore American history because it's not something that I would really gravitate towards or study within my degree. So kind of pursuing it through fiction has been, yeah, a really interesting and different way to kind of discover those histories and experiences.
Thank you. Megan?
Yeah, so my main interest in American studies is probably more through the historical discipline, which is actually quite a new interest for me, because at school we mainly focused around modern British European history. So it wasn't until first year where I did the modules Rise and Fall of American Slavery and the American Revolution, which really ignited my interest, and that's carried on through second and third year. My main interest, I think, materializes through women's experiences, and particularly gendered representation in political culture and how women engage with the assumedly patriarchal American revolutionary ideologies and stuff like that. So that's my main interest.
Great. Nelly?
Mine started a lot with American plays, and then mostly centered around like 1940s, 1950s. I was studying and then also going to watch with like friends and family, things like Streetcar Named Desire, Death of a Salesman, things like that. And then I started to shift once coming to uni and doing American studies modules towards American history and starting to prefer that, especially like narratives of those that were enslaved. I've started to take a real interest in, which is sort of why the Deep is particularly interesting.
That's great. Thank you, everyone. And welcome again. So just to start us off with the Deep, what did you think? What spoke to you and why? Do we go and say more?
Enjoyed it. I was quite surprised because I'm not really a huge kind of fantasy reader. It's not something I'd go for. I tend to read more like realism. So it was a really interesting experience for me to read it from that perspective, and almost feel like the fantasy didn't take away from the kind of ideas that it was exploring. It still very much felt like there were strong elements of historical fiction and reality, even within the kind of world that is invented. And I really liked that and appreciated that.
I thought that it provoked so much thought in that like it sort of engages one part of your mind in the fantasy and fiction sort of reading that like I probably would have done a lot more when I was younger. And then also how you're constantly reminded how it's rooted in such a horrific part of history. So like you have the personal relationships between Yetu and like Uri and these other characters, but then you're reminded of why she's struggling and the point of the entire book, and it's really sad and it's quite emotional, I think, like an emotional story.
Yeah, following on from that, I think I do agree that it has a nice balance between the contradictory emotions and messages that Yetu is dealing with, and that the book tries to tackle with. I think for me, the one aspect which kind of resonated most for me was the kind of link between history and responsibility, and the kind of, the responsibility that Yetu has to tell the right history, and who has responsibility to tell history, share history, and to understand certain histories.
I'd have to say that I actually found the concept to be a bit elaborate. I enjoyed a lot of what the novella was doing in terms of the questions about the impact that a shared history of a group of people can have on how they function in the present day, and the benefits and drawbacks of forgetting the past or blocking out the past, remembering the past. How does this inform how, African Americans, for example, exist? How do they relate to their history? I found that to be really very interesting. I suppose I just maybe thought that what these questions were embedded in, I thought was maybe it was slightly maybe a little bit over the top at times, but I kind of got a little bit caught between trying to do one thing and another. But I really liked the overall terrain that the novella encouraged the reader to think about. These questions about the burden of holding on to the memories of your people. That was really strong, I thought.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point as well, is the responsibility and the shared history and how we can tackle that and how we can approach that. So I guess one question we could think about as well is what River Solomon themselves said is, I like what imagination can do for us. I think it creates possibility. I think it creates fun, but it also can help us tangle with real questions that challenge us in our day-to-day lives. So in light of their note, how does this novella inform you of the transatlantic slave trade? How does it fit into the many fiction-based reality or alternative history literature, such as Octavia Butler's Kindred or Parable of the Sower, or a more recent books, I don't know if you know this, is Nicole Glover's The Conductors and Undertakers, which takes the underground railway system of freeing the enslaved, includes magic into it. So it's another kind of a take on that. So how would you associate this? How do you draw history out of a book such as this?
For me, it really reminded me of my favorite novel, which is Beloved by Toni Morrison, especially with the idea of rememberings. Really, as soon as I read that, it reminded me of the kind of idea of rememory, which is a big theme in that novel. And I was reading an article about the kind of role of imagination in Beloved, which Beloved is less of a fantasy, it's more magical realism. The fantasy element is a lot smaller than in this example, but I think it's still kind of a valuable connection because there were definitely similarities. And in this article, it said that alternative histories require a turn to fiction to give form to the traumatic voids of our past. So kind of taking reality and then spinning it with kind of fantasy, magical elements almost helps to maybe fill in some of the gaps that we wouldn't necessarily have or be able to kind of pull from real examples, because it's aspects of history that have been lost because it's voices that have been lost.
Actually, that's a really good point. It reminds me of the dilemma that historians have when it comes to making films about history, i.e. films that have a narrative, not documentaries, just I don't know, any film about history, right? But there are certain things that historians don't know about a particular time period. You can choose any film, really. So they have to fill in the gaps, as you're saying. I mean, there has to be something about, even if it's little details, like the kind of uniforms they wore or how they would conduct themselves socially. There could be these little bits and pieces just missing from our knowledge about how different civilizations operated. But the filmmaker has to just essentially kind of close these gaps up with certain things, just make these kind of assumptions. And I think the good thing about this fantasy approach is that it does provide a useful cover for any kind of maybe boring minor history details. It does allow you to kind of really draw on the emotional aspect of it, but it also can throw up, as we were talking about before, all these really relevant historical questions that any historian should be engaging with as well. So I think that's something that is a real benefit. I do like the sound of that novel of the kind of magic underground railway. I'll need to get the name of that one from you again.
This is like a little bit different to what you guys were saying. I think that it's really interesting because often with history and like narratives and stories about this kind of history, they have to undertell and they can't really explain the full story because often people wouldn't believe them, or people wouldn't understand the stories because they didn't directly experience it, so they can't imagine the horrors. But I think framing it within fantasy and fiction sort of gives you the opportunity to look at it as a whole, as a fantasy, and then really zone in on the bits that are true. And it's sort of, you see it through a different lens, which makes it slightly easier to believe and understand, even though the irony is that it is technically fiction.
Yeah, I think linking it back to how you kind of go about approaching American studies, I think it links to a lot of the resurgence in sort of popular history and collective memory, which links to like the 1619 project and Black History Month. Is kind of, I think it allows one to like escape boundaries, or I think perimeters is the word Solomon uses quite often, and kind of escapes certain boundaries that you look at history from a university seminar room, let's say, and it kind of gives the right of freedom to explore so many emotions, which is more than just a university seminar room would, and make it more accessible for numerous amounts of people.
Yeah, that's brilliant. For me, for example, there was a quote on because I have in my copy on page 21-22 at the very end, there's a quote where Yetu is thinking about the comb that she had found or had been gifted, and says it was one of the few tangible things she touched of the past, a reminder that the history was not an imagining, not just electrical pulses. They were people who'd lived, who'd breathed and wept and loved and lost. And I thought that was kind of a nice way of framing that concept between imagining and history, and it resonates a lot what you are all saying about the relatability and escaping the boundaries of understanding when it's not your own history, especially, and gives kind of that depth to it, maybe that would be otherwise, as you were saying, unfathomable for someone who doesn't share that same background, maybe.
Can I jump in?
Of course.
I love the number of puns that you almost can't help but make on depth and fathoming. But I was just thinking it was interesting you introduced it as a utopian fantasy. And I mean, certainly in lots of ways it is, but to Yetu, clearly, you know, it's constant pain, you know, the necessity of remembering, you know, having this obligation to remember and relate memory. But it's almost a memory. It's almost a utopia for the others who don't have to remember, but who have to. You know, they have this sort of purging annual ceremony where they remember and then they forget, and then they can live their lives again. And then there's this whole question of the question it raises is. Which one is better, which one really helps people to live, you know, which one really gives people an identity? Is it being able to construct themselves from their own imagination of what the past may be, or is it being rooted in a shared history that perhaps is so painful that it causes you physical suffering? And one of the interesting things is, and as Megan was saying with things like the 1619 project, I think one of the key things we look for in American studies always is starting points, whether it's 1619 or 1492 or 1865. And in this case, it's, you know, the sort of throwing overboard of enslaved women in the Middle Passage, and seeing that as a starting point and where the logical end might be. And I mean, fantasy is just has always been a fantastic way of taking almost hypothetical histories and spinning them out into finding what a utopia may or may not be.
There was something I'm not exactly sure. It's early in the book. I'm trying to find it, but I can't find the specific quote. But they suggest that there's a suggestion that. No, sorry. Can somebody help me out with the pronunciation of? Is it the Wajinru?
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah. There's a suggestion that they've essentially evolved to not remember. To have short-term memories, like, and I think there's something that's like officially like they Yeah, I think it's something to do with the short-term memory. Sorry, I can't find the specific quote. But
I know what you mean. They've been asked to keep in the present, past is the past, and they've been encouraged to do that. This is why the one person is the historian, always holding on to those things. I know what you're saying. It is explained. I can't remember the page number exactly, but it is explained exactly. It's not that they don't hold memories, because obviously they remember each other, even the ones that gather to this remembrance party or celebration or this event. They recognize each other, they know each other, so they do develop those kind of memories, but it's the past that is the past. And anytime there's Amaba has a confrontation with Yetu, for example, a moment later she said, it's the past now. They're moving on, they're not holding on to it. So yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah, what I really liked about that idea was it being an evolutionary survival mechanism to essentially block out the trauma. So that was a very interesting concept. They're putting all the trauma onto one person as their social responsibility to do the remembering. And this throws up a really interesting idea about the benefits or the upsides and the downsides of breaking from the past, drawing a line under it for the benefit of the collective psyche or the shared experience of a harmonious present moment, within culture. And what are the benefits of that? That clearly it means that the pain is not constantly regurgitated all the time. But on the other hand, this embracing of the pain of the past, getting to grips with the history of your culture, from an African American perspective, I imagine this is something that, that you've posted a discussion actually already on this novella. And the people involved with that were talking about having to grapple with learning the true history of what it means to be an African American, and feeling as if they've reached their limit in terms of how much they can actually take in. And they feel like they don't want to know anymore because it's just too much information, it's too much to deal with. So what this novella seems to be an attempt trying to do is promote this idea that embracing the difficulty of the past is a necessary thing to bring society forward. It seems like a fairly straightforward point, but I think that idea of these creatures having evolved to just instinctually not deal with their past, I think is really quite pertinent. I'd be interested to hear what other people think about that idea.
I think it's really interesting how the novella itself kind of grapples with actually the question of, well, what is history? What does it mean to be a historian? Because they give her the title and then they kind of say that her job is to remember. And at the start of the novella, it kind of conflates history with memory, and history is just knowing what happens in the past. And I think from that perspective, it's really understandable why just kind of sitting with that knowledge and not actively engaging in discussion about it, not kind of acting upon that, is too much for anyone to handle. But then the kind of revelation comes by the end when they all share the history and they all talk about it. And there's a scene with the comb where they kind of realize what the comb means, and it's kind of their interpretation. And it says that the living put their own mark on the dead. And it kind of reclaims history as being this kind of two-way street and this interaction with the past, rather than just being kind of a chronology of everything bad that's ever happened. It's also about their interpretation and how they kind of interact with it.
Leading on from that, I think one of the core contradictions to the novella would probably be that there's a shared history of oppression, but I think it's important to highlight individual experiences within that. And I think that's actually quite a historiographical debate that's currently happening between kind of the resurgence of contributionist history, and it's kind of recognizing individuals' experiences and enslaved people's achievements from within which they were bounded, if that makes sense. So it isn't just a history of oppression, there was a continuation of heritage, rituals and cultures, which I think is what the comb represents, in contrast to, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but Yetu would consistently say the traditional history is that the two-legged were savages, and there's that kind of contradiction between the two.
Yeah, I think the comb's quite a compelling image because it's kind of, I guess, a representation of like historical artifacts and like tangible historical evidence. And I think the choice of a comb, when there is so much you could have picked from kind of, you know, the history of slavery, a comb is just a comb. It's quite a mundane like object. It's something that, you know, a woman would have used to do her hair with. I think there's something quite, yeah, I think building on what Megan said, the idea that that's not kind of inherently bad, and it's through that comb they kind of have a celebration and a like of the remnants of a culture that has kind of been lost and devastated because of slavery.
Yeah, it's the ending of the book, especially when they split this responsibility of the memories, and what comes across is not each of them have the same amount or the same memories. It's shared, it's split. The quote itself says they each held pieces of the history now, divvied up between them. They shared it and discussed it. They grieved. Sometimes they wanted to die, but then they would remember it was done. Whenever an event triggered a remembering, they spoke those words, it is done, because it was. What do you think about that shared? Why I'm getting into this is because there is a fantastic similar type of book club meeting where this book was in depth discussed between booktubers, Ashley, Erica, Harley, Brie, and Chloe, and I will share the link with the video then as well. And they narrowed down at one point of this discussion that the main theme of the deep that they feel is important and must be taken is empathy, and how that relates to that how that leads to that relatability. So I had the question, what are your thoughts? How would you kind of, do you relate to it? How would you relate to it? And how does that speak about the remembering responsibility, especially if it is divvied up, because everyone would have a core experience that is different than other people. So it happens, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, sorry, let me just get it. I'm terrible with the names of the characters. Yetu, sorry. At one point, she says that she couldn't shake the feeling. It says that it might kill her, the state she was in. She couldn't shake the feeling that it already had, that it had been poisoning her for 2 decades. For the 2 decades she'd been the historian. So this idea of dividing sharing the memories out, this you really see when she flees, she just takes off, and she can't take the pressure anymore. It's too much. It's too much responsibility for her to have. So in leaving, she doesn't really find any resolution to that problem, because now all she's doing is just trying to escape the reality. So she finds herself in this bind where it seems to be a stark choice of taking on more than she can handle or just abandoning the entire culture. And I think this is a really strong focal point of the book here, because it seems to be putting across the point that there's a responsibility for people to engage with their own history in a way that is, yes, particularly important regarding the slave trade and whatnot.
I thought one of the quotes that was really interesting is when it says that these were her people, her extended kin, but they were also death itself. When they had their fill of rememberings, they would come for her and pour it back into Yetu, a cracked vessel. And I think it's a very thought-provoking quote, and it does lead to a lot of empathy in that it makes her seem quite lonely. Just the thought of her being a cracked vessel, and her family, her people, are her version of death itself. And I think it's very emotive, and it's really powerful because it sort of describes the immense stress and pain that she had, not only from having to remember her history, but in the quote, it almost seems like she had it from her family as well, or not her family, but her people, and the expectations they had of her. And I think that leads to a lot of empathy.
Yeah, I think leading on from that, I think there was like a similarity between a quote I found at the beginning and the end of the book. And at the beginning, she says, there is a gap between us that cannot be bridged. And at the end, she says, knowledge of rituals, prayers, and family, that gaps could be survived and made full again, but only if you were still living. So I think trajectorily, that is that creation of empathy. I think not just between the characters, but I think as readers reading it, I think it's the connection between the author and the readers as well.
Absolutely, definitely. I did have a question which actually came from Molly, so if Molly doesn't mind, I'll read it for you here. As American Studies is an interdisciplinary field, what argument can you make for the benefits of studying fiction like this novella alongside historical texts?
And since lots of you aren't from American Studies, I guess, could you see a benefit in doing those two things together, and in adding kind of elements of different fields into your own primary field?
I would say definitely yes. As somebody who's is doing a joint honours in English literature and history, it's immensely valuable. I venture to guess that if I hadn't studied so much about the transatlantic slave trade, I might have missed a thing or two, maybe missed a few of the points that River Solomon was trying to put across in this book. So absolutely, I think it's absolutely essential, really, to enrich your understanding of history. But there's a lot of truth in fiction as well, so you definitely pick up historical knowledge from fiction. But yeah, I would say it's really important.
Well, as Aya said, in relation to the booktubers discussion, I mean, if the key point, or at least one key point in reading this book is the empathy it inspires, I think that's the whole. I think that's the whole job of fiction, really, and the kind of thing that often history, pure and plain, though it's never, in fact, objective, as we all know, but that struggles to provide. Putting that into a narrative, you're always going to be bending it to some purpose. And as I think the events and the themes of this novella suggest, history is purposeful when it brings things and people together, when it provides common understandings and a way to understand one another. And that, I think, is often the gap that fiction bounded by certain historical events can provide. And I mean, well, for example, Liam talked about getting into American studies through Steinbeck. I mean, if you read Steinbeck, you don't just get into American fiction. You get into the fight between United Farm Workers in the state of California, and you get into the politics of Dust Bowl America and the New Deal, and there is no line, and I think that's one of the reasons why American Studies is valuable, because it never pretends there's a line between the literary and the historical.
I think that like the personal and emotional element is really important with fiction, especially fiction like this that's written from kind of African American perspectives, because it's a period of history where kind of those perspectives are very hard to find, especially female perspectives, just because of the reality and that most were not literate, and able to kind of actually record their thoughts and feelings. So I think that fiction has a real power to try and reclaim that to an extent, and for people today to kind of almost envision those perspectives and show the more emotional side, even though it's not objective history and it's fictionalized. I think that there's a lot of power and value in trying to like create empathy for those people that we can't get from their own voices because their own voices have been lost to us.
One thing I would actually, probably a good time to bring this up, is just how beneficial or how effective things are defamiliarized in this novella. That's something that's really, really strong all the way through. Describing human beings as land-dwelling two legs or things like that, you know, just it all seems very alien, very foreign, and I think that's a really effective. It's a really effective use of defamiliarization to create this separation, create this distance, this feeling of uncertainty or alienation or mystery, not being able to reconcile the atrocities of the past that the land dwellers have committed here. And Nomi, you were mentioning the female perspective being largely absent. Thinking about something like Harriet Jacobs, her narrative uses prose in a way that is incredibly valuable in helping the reader understand the material circumstances of a woman in that situation. And it's the difference between history and fiction. It's the difference between just historical facts and this narrative aspect to it, where you can learn things about the individual experience that are lost in a history textbook, you know.
I think that kind of relates to the other question Molly had sent me in advance, and I don't know if you want to read it or should I read it out loud. I'm happy to do that as well. About the environmental change, how the novella considers both environmental change, the changes to the environment caused by humanity, and erases environmental adaptations, changes to physical bodies caused by the environment. How are these two things working together in the novella? And does the novella address these two urgent themes, racism and environmental destruction, effectively? So that kind of feeds into that idea of defamiliarization as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think for me, to give a little bit of context for why this stood out to me, I think because a lot of our discussion has been about history and about the weight of history and how that's playing into the novel, but this kind of idea of climate change, which is worked into the novella, kind of wouldn't have been a thought back in the time period that we're talking about. So it's really kind of bringing it up, kind of mixing this contemporary issue with a historical one in a way that I think is interesting. I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, because at the end of the novel, isn't it, there's this big storm that kind of wipes out the two legged race. So that does speak quite directly into the concept of climate change and how nature and storms and all of those, and how this adaptability becomes a necessity almost.
Or even just provoking nature. I'm trying to find. I'm really so. Oh, here we go. Got it. There's a section now. I'm not sure what version everybody has. Probably is it the same online version we've all got? So I've got it on page 110, and it's when there's the description of a metal fish with a spinning tail fin with land dwellers inside. I was kind of interested to get your thoughts on what you think that might be. Obviously, I've got my ideas of what's being described there, but that's a really strange way of describing what we're seeing there. So this idea of the human race abusing nature, bending nature to, or making nature conform to our own will, shaping nature and reaping the consequences of that, as you're saying, with the huge tidal wave at the end. This is, yeah, it's an interesting layer to this, for sure.
It really comes down to the kind of destructive nature of humans, and I think that really underpins the whole of the novella through, like, obviously the horrific memories of the history, but then again, like, the kind of flashbacks to, like, the bombs being dropped in the sea. And the book doesn't necessarily place itself in a specific time, which I thought was quite clever, because it kind of avoids us bringing kind of contextual assumptions to it, but there's still inferences you can make. Like, it definitely kind of raised themes of, like, war. And there was a really interesting quote which described the two legs, or the humans, as cruel and unusual, and I thought that that was a really interesting combination of words, because it almost suggests that the cruelty and the human capacity for destruction is what makes us unusual, especially for our own kind, because you kind of don't really see other species kind of achieving the same level of devastation to other members of their species for no kind of real reason than you do with humans. I thought that was a really interesting observation, and kind of cruel and unusual I thought was a really nice combination.
And it also suggests cruel and unusual punishment as a phrase. I just wanted to note, in terms of the question Molly asked, that obviously this novella has a very collaborative origin story in the Clipping song, which was originally commissioned by This American Life, the podcast, and then it took its inspiration from Drexciya, the group, which is Detroit-based. And not to get on my soapbox about Detroit, but it's a city that, since it's fallen from its industrial height, has become a site where it's almost necessary to think of the future, because the present is not a place of opportunity. The future thinking, and by extension the sort of genre of Afrofuturism, almost grows naturally in lots of parts of post-industrial urban America today, where there are whole neighborhoods which, for various complicated historical reasons, have become either abandoned or entirely African American, and largely ignored by public services and public investment, where it falls to the individual and the community to create a future if they want one at all. And I think that is a really powerful theme in stories like these ones, where it falls to not the continuation of the present state, but it falls to the creation of a new way of thinking, a new way of approaching the world to create a future. It's almost in my life, I rarely think about consciously creating the future, because it's going to be a continuation of what's happened. But there is a situation here where you have to create the future rather than just continuing what's happened. And that is a site of both possibility and, I imagine, fright.
Yeah, I was wondering about the myself being a literary student as such, and I know not everyone here is, about the genre or the style of the book, that if you're getting into the actual way it's been written or the style. Solomon themselves describe their work as a speculative, a broad category of anything that is slightly askew with reality. This includes sci-fi, fantasy, fabulism, folklorism, magical realist tradition, and all of this. So what is your understanding of speculative fiction, and how does it fit into analyzing this novella, and how would you like to be taught when reading something like this? What would you like to take out of it?
I think speculative fiction as an umbrella term is really useful because it avoids kind of putting the novella into a box, especially with fantasy. I think there's a risk with just calling it fantasy, because fantasy definitely implies kind of an alternate universe or a different world, but the implication in this book is that it's in line with our world. It's kind of existing within the world that we live in today and kind of alongside the historical realities that do exist. So I think slightly askew with reality is a really accurate way to describe it, because the events of the book, even though they are fantastical and they are impossible, don't necessarily contradict any of the real history that kind of underpins the whole thing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I really like the way you put that. I think it's from a perspective of, I mean, obviously it's very, when I used the word elaborate at the start, I mean this idea that it's, of course it's literally impossible, and maybe there's just something in me that I'm more interested in the gritty realist fiction. So when I started reading this, there was part of me that was a bit like, what? But once I get past that, you start to really see that there's a really interesting like back and forth, because it's obviously very impossible, but as you're saying, it's really strictly rooted in real history as well. So that's an interesting judgment that the author makes in terms of how closely to adhere to history and how loosely to adhere to science, for example, you know. So that's a lot of fun there, like, you know, to move these things around, and because it would have been very easy to just make up an entirely new, different history that's completely different from ours. But that's not what they've done. They've anchored this fantasy tale in quite a realist interpretation of history. Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, I think that to call it speculative fiction is so much better than calling it fantasy, like Naomi said. And like, I wouldn't necessarily have thought of it that way before, because I was referring to it as fantasy earlier on, but it does make so much sense, because obviously it's aligned with real things that would have happened. And with what you were asking about how it should be taught, or how like I would want it to be taught, is not it's quite easy to forget that it's rooted in something that happened and history. And I think that while I sort of got more in touch with like the personal relationships in the story and the fantasy part of it, and only sort of remembered at the beginning and at the very end sort of the horrors that this entire thing is based around. And I think that it's really important that knowing more about the context of the Middle Passage and the slave trade is so important with this book.
Yeah, I'd just like to add there, actually, just quickly, just regarding one of the questions that you sort of suggested, points of discussion, suggestions. There's one that talks about considering this story to be a good place to start thinking about the history of slavery in the Middle Passage, and I would probably suggest it's maybe not the best place to start, because I think there's quite a lot of background knowledge that's not really in this novella. So I think it probably would require somebody with a pretty firm grasp of the slave trade. I think the deeper your knowledge of history, the the more you're going to get out of this dynamic that's being played out in the novella. But I mean, it would be interesting to see, or maybe a young child or something that doesn't have much knowledge of it would think of these things, you know, if it brings anything into focus for them.
Yeah, it could be for someone without the history, without the knowledge, someone younger, for example, it might be a more approachable way of beginning to think these massive traumatic events and the huge history. And this is why I agree with what Naomi was saying as well earlier about the time, that there's no time in this novella as such. It's not placed in any specific era. It talks about 600 years of history, talks about the wars, it talks about this and that, and then there's the ending of the world almost, which could be very current or futuristic even. So it just gives that sensation of that this is something that could be happening now, has happened in the past, could happen in the future, and how that all comes together. So it might be in a way an easier entry into starting to grasp these massive concepts and history.
Yeah, and I wonder whether there's whether you see that history in a different way if this is the place you begin. You know, if you begin with an understanding of this history as a site of possibility, or as one where the consideration of how to share the history, how to hold on to it, how to remember, how it affects people on an emotional and physical level is taken as central to begin with, because I think that the majority of our historical understanding, especially if we begin as children, of these big global historical narratives is kind of accidental, and often the initial impressions we get really stick much more than, you know, if we're reading it as adults and trying to rework the way we think about things. So yeah, I wonder if this was where you began, where you might end up.
I feel like I'm quite close to being convinced here. First, I was a bit skeptical about this being a starting point, but that's actually a really interesting way of putting it. I think this is a novella that's going to be extremely thought-provoking to somebody who doesn't have maybe a particularly full understanding of the transatlantic slave trade. There's a point in the story where the land dwellers, or the whoever it would be, they're referred to as being a devil. People who are on board these ships as a devil. So that's a really it's a very emotive term that's being used there. So again, this is something that's going to throw up questions of good and evil, and you know, there's that aspect to it as well.
And I just wanted to note that I think speculative fiction, at least in common parlance, comes a lot from Margaret Atwood, who talks about how she writes speculative fiction, especially her trilogy that begins with Oryx and Crake, which is also very concerned with climate change and imagining where that future might lie.
It's a multi-layered novella. For such a short novella, I think there could be hundreds of different venues you can spin it. If teaching it, you can spin it in a great example of speculative fiction. If you're going purely in the literary studies side of things, you can use it as an entryway for understanding the long-term impact, the multiple layers of transatlantic slave trade, where a group of people were literally forced to adapt to a new environment, because that could also then lead into a political discussion of forcing people to having to deal with new environments that they've been forced to go into after being stolen from their original communities, and so on and so on. I think there's just this massive discussion that could go on forever, but I am conscious of the time that we don't have forever. So I would like to now just invite you, if you have any final thoughts or comments. For example, let's finish with, would you recommend this book to your friends, to your colleagues at the university? Would it be something you would go and say, read this if you want to understand XYZ? Any thoughts?
Sorry for the cop-out answer here, but I would probably say it depends on who I'm recommending it to. So I know that's quite evasive of me, but my own personal preferences, I like the mundane, gritty, realist stuff. That's my personal taste. But yeah, sorry, I can't give you a better answer than that.
I'd probably recommend it, like it was talked about before, to someone that actually did know a little bit about the history behind it, because I think that really transforms the novella from like a really interesting fictional tale to, you know, like this deeply rooted speculative fiction novella that just has so much more depth, I think. So I would recommend it to someone that at least sort of knew what it was based on and knew what it was about. But, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with the last point Nelly said. I've been talking about it to my roommate who also does history, about the concept and its premise, and he said as well he would be interesting to see how history relates to the speculative fiction and how that would work. So I definitely agree with it.
Any thoughts, Naomi? Or are you not having anything?
Yeah, no, I think I probably would recommend it. But I do agree with Liam that it would depend on who it was, because I've definitely had experiences with recommending, like I said, Toni Morrison is my favorite author. So sometimes I've lent people those books and I've had very, very mixed reactions, because I think it's definitely there's a taste for that kind of fiction that kind of is a bit more abstract in its concepts but rooted in reality. So I think definitely depending on who it was, but I would probably recommend it.
What about Sam and Molly? Any thoughts you have?
Yes, I would recommend it, and I think, especially for if you're going to have a group of people who all read it, it's a very good spur to conversation, as I think we have found.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, it's always kind of interesting to get people to approach historical events from different perspectives, and especially if somebody was used to approaching it from a more kind of purely historical angle, this would be a really great way to kind of stir up kind of different discussion points and think about it from a completely new direction.
Yeah, I agree with everyone. Obviously, literature, especially films, literature, all of this culture, it's a lot to do with taste as well, isn't it? Everyone kind of approaches it from a different perspective, from personal experience, from personal preferences, whatever it is. I am not a fantasy reader at all, or speculative fiction. I just generally have never been navigated towards that. But this, because of the history I have, because I have extensive academic background in that side of things, through my master's degrees and my PhD, that directly kind of relate to these things. So I got that side of it, and for that, I would recommend that book, especially for younger students, first year, second years, because I think that is just a way to kind of build that literary, political, historical contexts in a new way that doesn't feel as pressured immediately. And obviously then when you start peeling the layers, you understand all the kind of the depth of it. I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed the book and can recommend it in future, and I hope to see you all again in another book club another time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Aya.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much.